Good evening and welcome to this first one of 2015. And a very interesting matter that we would like to concentrate on is also a very inconclusive matter in the sense that the present conference of parties that took place at this place called as Lima in Peru about what is known as climate change is merely recommendatory in nature. So it has made a certain sort of recommendation for what is called as the next round of talks, which should be held in Paris and which would start in Paris somewhere in the middle of 2015. Apeksha अशी आहे की by the end of 2015 they'll hammer out a deal which will take the place of the Kyoto Protocol which was established in 1992. अर्थात आता याच्यामध्ये अनेक लेवल्सला इश्यूज आणि प्रॉब्लेम्स आहेत आणि वी नीड टू सॉर्ट ऑफ बी व्हेरी केअरफुल अबाउट दोज इश्यूज एंड प्रॉब्लम्स बिफोर वी थिंक इन टर्म्स ऑफ कि पेरिस से निकलने वाला क्या है और लीमा ने एग्जैक्टली रेकमेंड क्या किया है. ओके, नाउ द लास्ट वन दैट appeared in 1992. The last one, if you take into consideration the fact that there is a problem on your hands, has been singularly ineffectual in preventing climate change. Kyoto एक चीज के बारे में it did lay out a multilateral mechanism to deal with a problem that is called as climate change, but in terms of action on climate change, Kyoto is a singular failure. Nothing has been achieved out of it. The world's climate has steadily kept on increasing, and on a completely cloudy day in the month of January, wherein possibly in this part of the world one doesn't expect the sort of clouds that we have seen throughout the day, which brought us very close to rains. I need not labor the point na, like we are living through climate change. January is not supposed to be a clouded season on the west coast of India, on the western side of the Indian peninsula. The eastern side might be, especially the southeastern side, पण वेस्टर्न कोस्टलाइन किंवा वेस्टर्न एरियाज जे आहेत हे काही फारसे क्लाउडेड नसतात इन द मंथ ऑफ जानेवारी. पण जर इन द मंथ ऑफ जानेवारी क्लाउडेड असतील तर आय नीड नॉट एट ऑल इवन मेन्शन द फॅक्ट दॅट वी आर लिव्हिंग थ्रू समथिंग दॅट इज कॉल्ड एज क्लाइमेट चेंज. ओके, देयर इज हार्डली एनी कंट्री, एनी रीजन ऑन द फेस ऑफ द अर्थ which has been unaffected by it, and despite the fact that Kyoto did lay out a protocol for multilateral action, the very fact that we have a January clouded day is enough to prove that Kyoto has been a failure. You don't need this as such. You have so many other events cumulatively speaking, but it's a singular failure. ज्या एका गोष्टीसाठी क्योटो एस्टॅब्लिश केलं गेलं त्या एका गोष्टीमध्ये फारशी काही ट्रॅक्शन नाही, फारसा काही बदलाव नाही आणि याची अनेकविध प्रकारची कारणं आहेत की वाय एक्झॅक्टली इज इट दॅट वी हॅव नॉट गॉट एनी ट्रॅक्शन एज फार एज क्योटो इज कन्सर्न. And how exactly is the approach as of now different? Okay, now if you look at what was done in Lima and what would form the basis of discussions in Paris, we are more or less carrying on with same of what we had yesterday. Rather than making a serious effort to go about changing things and rather than breaking the old mold, जो चल रहा है वो एक ही किस्सा चल रहा है, जो कल वाला किस्सा था उसी को आगे दोहराया जा रहा है. Okay, actually what's happening is it's much more terrible. अर्थात सगळ्यांसाठी एका अर्थाने ते बरं आहे कारण some or the other they all feel की like this is safe enough. One very important problem that one sees as far as the Lima and the Paris talks are concerned, the consequent Paris talks are concerned, climate change affects all, yet the agency for all action is what is called as a nation state. So it does affect all. It does affect all ecosystems. It does affect all types of climatic regions. It does affect all human societies all over the world. पण उसका इफेक्टिव एक्शन जो है उसके खिलाफ जो एक्शन करने वाली एजेंसी है वो अभी भी नेशन स्टेट ही है. और नेशन स्टेट का प्रॉब्लम ये है कि द नेशन स्टेट कैन नॉट थिंक बियॉन्ड द कन्फाइंस ऑफ द नेशन स्टेट. कि नेशन स्टेट का परमानेंट प्रॉब्लम ये है कि हमारी नेशन स्टेट की जो एक पॉलिटिकल फ्रंटियर है हमें उसके आगे जाके सोचना नहीं है. हमें उसके आगे जाके किसी भी चीज के बारे में ना तो कोई तवज्जो देनी है, ना ही इसके बारे में सोचना है कि भाई इसका हम जो कर रहे हैं इसके नतीजे क्या होंगे या व्हाट एग्जैक्टली वुड कम आउट ऑफ इट. सो लॉन्ग एज व्हाट आई एम डूइंग विद इन द कन्फाइंस ऑफ माई नेशन स्टेट इज समथिंग दैट द अदर नेशन स्टेट्स एक्सेप्ट, एवरीथिंग इज वेल एंड गुड. सो ऑन द फेस ऑफ इट इट सीम्स लाईक एकदम एक नॉर्मल इंटरनॅशनल ट्रीटी जशी असते ना की याच्यामध्ये तुम्ही एक ऍक्शन प्रपोज करता, इतर पार्टीज ज्या आहेत या सगळ्या शो मधल्या ज्या तुमच्यासारख्याच इतर नेशन स्टेट्स आहेत तर तुम्ही जी ऍक्शन प्रपोज केलेली ती ऍक्शन स्वीकारतात. असं झाल्याच्या नंतर आपल्याकडे एक आंतरराष्ट्रीय करार निर्माण होतो. आता याच्या अंतर्गत आपण जे काही अग्री केलेलं आहे, लेट्स वर्क आउट विदिन आवर कन्फाइन्स अँड दॅट्स द एंड ऑफ द स्टोरी. And the problem is climate change is not this sort of a phenomena. Climate change calls in for a drastic action, and most importantly it calls in for thinking beyond the nation state. But our problem is we do acknowledge the problem that this is something that spans, transcends and moves beyond the frontiers of nation states, but inevitably action is going to happen within the confines of the nation state. और ये नेशन स्टेट के बाहर जाने वाला जो किस्सा है, इसको किस तरह से हम एक तरह से ट्रांसेंड करें, इसको किस तरह से हम इसके बाहर जाके सोचे, समथिंग दैट नोबडी हैज एनी फिगर ऑफ एन आइडिया अबाउट. Okay, so we are like sort of bogged down as far as this whole business is concerned. Interestingly, the Lima Conference of Parties does something very funny by saying this, that there's going to be an intended national sort of a commitment in terms of how much should you reduce your greenhouse gases. Okay, सगळं जाऊन फायनली थांबलेलं कुठं आहे की the world's surface temperature should not increase beyond 2 degrees Celsius at the end of this century. We should do everything possible to curtail it below that 2 degrees Celsius wala business. All available scientific data proves that that is just not going to happen until and unless drastic action isn't done. Ekdam drastic action which would call in for a complete overhaul in terms of the ways in which developed countries as well as developing countries conduct their affairs, in terms of a complete focus away from something that is called as consumption. But as of now, located at where we are in the early part of the 21st century, consumption is an inevitable part of our national economies. We cannot imagine life beyond consumption. There's a very close nexus between what we consume and what we produce, and there's a very close nexus between that and the sort of strength, power that we feel in terms of modern nation states. So in this entire business ये सारी चीजें एक दूसरे से जुड़ी हुई है. अब प्रॉब्लम ये है कि if we cannot curtail consumption, if we cannot change the very course of our economies, the Earth's climate by the time this century is out is definitely going to increase by something like 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. तो वो 2 degrees Celsius वाला जो एक उम्मीद है, जो एक ambition है कि it should be curtailed to 2 degrees Celsius, possibly seems not to be happening. Okay, आणि everyone is very happy and interested in passing the buck की who is responsible for what आणि तुम्ही तुमच्या लेवलला काय काय करणं गरजेचं आहे. ओके, वन वे आउट दॅट लीमा प्रपोज्ड इज इंटरनली तुम्ही प्रत्येकाने ठरवा की तुम्ही काय कमिटमेंट्स केल्या पाहिजेत इन टर्म्स ऑफ रिड्यूसिंग ग्रीन हाऊस गॅसेस. यू वॉलंटरीली कम अप विथ दीज कमिटमेंट्स, यू वॉलंटरीली अबाइड बाय इट, and there would be little of what is called as mandatory international supervision or some sort of intervention if you in some way or the other are not able to meet those commitments. Okay, so जे क्योटो होतं त्याच्याही पलीकडची treaty is what has been planned. Lima will hash out a treaty which will come into force after 2020. Now we have ample amount of time for destroying as many number of things as is possible. So idea ऐसी है कि लीमा का जो proposal है should go to Paris by the middle of 2015. We should gather in Paris and start negotiating a treaty between us. We have ample amount of time till the end of almost 2015 to come up with a treaty that is acceptable to all nations and all countries. 1992 sort of was only about what is called the developed world. Sort of was about what is called a historical responsibility for polluting the environment, and this is something that was believed to be the responsibility of the developed world. By the time you come to Lima, Paris 2014, 2015, the idea is कि developed world के बारे में बात करना फिजूल है, because the developing world is an equally big culprit, and something needs to be done to target and tag on to the developing world. Okay. As of now, when I am talking to you of the total emissions on the face of this earth, the largest emissions come from a country that is called as China. Okay, which by no estimate can be called as a developed country. It is a rapidly developing country, but certainly is not a developed country. Of the total emissions that are emitted by all the countries on the face of the earth, the Chinese emissions count for 24%, which is like phenomenal, huge. If you look in terms of what is called the per capita emissions, they are much lower as compared to, say for example, the second largest emitter, which is the United States of America, which emits something like 16% of the total greenhouse gases which are emitted on the surface of this earth as of now. But in terms of per capita emission, like दरडोई ज्याला आपण emissions म्हणतो ते अमेरिकेच्या बाबतीत जास्त आहेत as compared to what the Chinese have. ओके, आता हा जो बॅलन्स आहे हा कसा साधायचा की in terms of net emissions by any country, the Chinese have the largest emissions. But in terms of what is called as per capita emissions, the Chinese have the lowest emissions when you compare it with the American emissions. Okay, when it comes to अपन तर त्या बाबतीत में I don't know, the Indians are possibly a very pathetic lot and need not even be talked about in this show. But somehow or the other, with whatever they have done, they have decided that they are going to corner the Indians in a big way. Just to put in some figures, as far as we in India are concerned, the total emissions stand at something like 4 tons per capita. Okay, so darvarshi the Indian emissions stand at something like 4 tons per capita. Every Indian goes about emitting something like 4 tons. In terms of total greenhouse gases emitted, this is just 6%. 0.6. Okay, it's hardly anything. But in terms of countries, this is where they play a smart game. Actually, in terms of a single economic bloc, the European Union is the 3rd largest emitter. But the European Union never works at this level by saying this, that we are going to act as an economic bloc. What they do is they split it up between countries, which automatically makes India the fall party in all of this, and we become what is called as the 3rd largest emitter. And you can very well imagine the Chinese at 24%, the Americans at 16%, and we at 6%. मैं almost एक Olympic gold medal tally वाली जैसा होता है ना in the first few days, and ऐसा दिखता है वो कि like if you look at the gap between the Americans, the Chinese on one hand and the Indians on the other hand, the gap is like so profound. The Americans emit 3 times what we do with a population which is 1/3 of what we have. Okay, the Chinese emit 4 times what we do with a population which is approximately 30 crores more than what we have. So I don't know how do you look at these figures, but they are very funny figures. Of course, they are very authentic figures for that matter of fact. Karan, I have brought them from UNFCCC का अपना जो website है. They come from there. So they are like in a way एकदम perfect figures in terms of whatever is happening. But if you look at them and try comparing them, I don't know. Why do those figures rankle? Let's be very clear about them. Why is it that these figures are problematic? Greenhouse gas emissions have a direct connection with what is called as total energy consumption as far as any economy is concerned. At 6% of the total world emissions, the Indian problem is we actually have an economy कि जिसका energy consumption बहुत poor है, और उसकी वजह ही जो बहुत सिंपल है, एक तो we don't have a heavy manufacturing economy of the variety that say for example the Americans or the Chinese have. So त्याच्या comparison मध्ये हमारा economic base जो है वो इतना heavily manufacturing based नहीं है कि which would require a huge amount of energy to be consumed. Even in terms of something like greenhouse gas effects, the picture that stands out is India is a much poor country. In terms of total energy consumption, जो इतना कम है, आपके गैस emissions कम होने की सबसे बड़ी वजह ये है because we are yet not a high energy consuming economy. One of the reasons why we are not a very high energy consuming economy, the first most important, because we are not a very high manufacturing economy, and B, the levels of consumption that we have are so small in terms of if you look at what the Chinese and the Americans go about consuming, कि even at the service sector end of the economy it's not possible for you all to generate more gases. हम बहुत गरीब है और हम बहुत गरीब है is what those figures are talking about. आ रहा है समझ में? The चालूगिरी that they have done is the Americans and the Chinese, even before they reached Lima, reached an agreement between themselves in terms of how much gases would they go about emitting. Now this is the smartest move which was ever done, and this is something that the Chinese have done. They should be credited with it for trying to understand कि एक नया international system काम कैसे करता है और इसमें how do you make your way through things. Now what the Chinese game is This deal which they have signed with the Americans is a deal की ज्याच्यामध्ये काय त्याला आपण म्हणतो ना दोन चोर एकत्र बसलेले between them, as I said, 24 and 16 is 40% of the total greenhouse gases are emitted by just these two countries with a population base of 1.5 billion and 330 million. That's like roughly सगळं आपण एकत्र करून 2 billion असं म्हणून टाकू. So like 1/3 of humanity goes about emitting something like 40% of these gases, and between them they have arranged for a deal. The deal is, the Chinese position is, by 2030 our greenhouse gas emissions would peak out, which effectively means that post 2030, that's almost 10 years after the new treaty comes into force, we won't be emitting the same level of gases that we are doing now. That is all. They have not even mentioned कि पीक आउट के बाद आप रिडक्शन के लिए जो मैकेनिज्म अडॉप्ट करने वाले हो उसकी वजह से आप एग्जैक्टली रिड्यूस करोगे तो कितना रिड्यूस करोगे. सो नो फिगर्स हैव बीन साइटेड except for something which says that 20% of all China's energy after 2030 will come from non-conventional energy sources. That is like wind energy, geothermal energy, solar energy and all of that. So we are working towards that. So 20% of our energy will come out of all of this. By 2030 our emissions will peak, and post 2030 when it comes to the Chinese emissions there would be a steady decline. There won't be a phenomena of what is called as rise. That's all that they have committed. Okay, now look at the shatter game that has been played around. The American idea is by 2025 we would emit 25% of what we were doing in 2005. आए समझ में कि 2025 में हम उतने ग्रीन हाउस गैसेस एमिट करेंगे कि जितने हम 2005 में एमिट करते थे. 25% of that is what we would start emitting, which effectively means कि those many number of cuts is what we would make as far as the American energy consumption as well as American greenhouse gas emission business is concerned. How are they going to achieve it? Oh well, they can very well do it if they want to. The only single problem is कि ये एक तरह से voluntarily declared है, ये अपने अपने लेवल पे किए गए कमिटमेंट्स है, ये नॉन वेरीफाइबल है, ये किसी भी तरह से इंपोज नहीं किए जा सकते हैं. एंड इफ से फॉर एग्जांपल यू डू नॉट एमिट 25% ऑफ व्हाट यू डिड इन 2005, देयर इज नो वे बाय व्हिच यू कैन पेनलाइज द अमेरिकंस. और इफ से फॉर एग्जांपल चाइनीज एमिशंस डोंट पीक आउट बाय 2030, यू आर नॉट इन अ पोजीशन टू पेनलाइज द चाइनीज. ओके, but everyone is very clear about this. Countries like India should do more. And the Indian problem is we just don't understand कि हमने आज की तारीख में क्या मोर किया है कि जिसके लिए we should be doing more in the future in terms of trying to reduce it. Okay, as of now the Indian emissions stand at 4. Even if you take into consideration the Chinese and the American claim of either peaking emissions by 2030 or 25% of 2005 wala level, Chinese and American emissions are going to stay at 12 tons per capita in 2030. Okay, 12 tons. Even then, at a point of which Indian emissions would possibly climb up to 8 tons per capita, which effectively means that the Chinese and the Americans would even then be emitting more as compared to what the Indians are doing. And with possibly, maybe there's a possibility कि अमेरिका का population definitely एक तरह से increase होगा on account of increased migration from all over the world. The Chinese population would either stay steady or would show you some negative growth. One of the reasons why the Chinese president is so optimistic about this की 2030 मध्ये आम्ही peak out होणार आहे, सगळ्यात महत्त्वाचं कारण is आम्ही काय प्रकारच्या टेक्नॉलॉजीज अडॉप्ट करणार आहे हे सगळं नंतर. We know for sure that the Chinese population is in an irreversible decline. And it's that decline which they are now hoping a lot on in terms of seeing to it that they would be reducing their emissions by 2030. पण एवढं सगळं करून देखील per capita they would be emitting more than what we are doing. Okay, the sad part of the story is आपण 2030 मध्ये देखील गरीबच असणार आहोत as compared to the two of them. म्हणजे as compared to what we are now, we would be rich, very rich, because we would be emitting twice what we are doing now. So as of now, if it is 4, by 2030 it's going to be 8. But as compared to what those two are, we would even then be poor. Even of course nobody knows. Matlab the Indian claim is we are the ones who are working more in terms of improved technologies, indigenous development of green technologies. We are doing everything at our level to see to it that there is going to be a more efficient use of technologies and of fuels, which will see to it that the emissions would stay under control. Okay, पण अर्थात एवढा घसा फाडून किंवा एवढं प्रेमाने दुसरं कुणीही बोलत नाही. त्यामुळे सगळ्यांचं म्हणणं आहे की ओके ठीक आहे, दिस इज व्हॉट वी विल गो टुवर्ड्स अँड दिस इज वेअर वी वुड स्टार्ट मेकिंग आवर कमिटमेंट्स. 2025 आहे, 2030 आहे. The European Union fits into this entire show by pushing its way by saying की आपण देखील याच्यामध्ये आपलं योगदान करू आणि आपण देखील अशाच पद्धतीने काम करू. प्रॉब्लेम असा होता की I think this was 2007 when the Bali Action Plan came. कि जहाँ it was decided कि developing countries should be helped by the developed world in terms of gaining access to funds as well as green technologies to help this issue. With a laudable aim in mind, a green climate fund was set up with the idea that by 2020 this fund will have $100 billion in it. Lima saw the conference of parties celebrating the fact that the fund now has $10 billion in it. And we are already half into this decade. आ रहा है समझ में? अच्छा, पैसा डालना किसने है? तो पैसा डालना है by the developed world. So the money has to come from the developed world. The money has to help the developing world access what are called as green technologies. नियत में कितना खोट है देखो कि जिस चीज के लिए ये कहा गया कि we'll put in $100 billion, half the decade is through, you have put in 1/10 of that money. You want everybody else to make their commitments, you want everybody else to do something or the other, और आपने जो पैसा शेल आउट करना है, we are selling out nothing as far as all of this is concerned. Okay, when it comes to green technology, साधी गोष्ट आहे की बाबा ट्रान्सपोर्टेशन आहे, मॅन्युफॅक्चरिंग आहे, रिअल एस्टेट डेव्हलपमेंट आहे, बिल्डिंग स्ट्रक्चर्स आहेत, या सगळ्या गोष्टींच्या बाबतीत द डेव्हलप्ड वर्ल्ड हॅज बेटर टेक्नॉलॉजीज एज कम्पेअर्ड टू व्हॉट द डेव्हलपिंग वर्ल्ड हॅज. द डेव्हलप्ड वर्ल्ड्स डिमांड इज प्लेन अँड सिम्पल की आमच्याकडे असलेली तंत्रज्ञान ही एकंदरीत आत्ताच्या घडीला असलेला हा जो काही पर्यावरणाचा प्रॉब्लेम आहे याच्या दृष्टीने पूरक अशा प्रकारची नाही. आम्हाला अशा प्रकारच्या तंत्रज्ञानांना ऍक्सेस असणं अपेक्षित आहे की ज्याच्यामुळे वी वुड बी इन अ पोझिशन टू मीट आवर रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी टुवर्ड्स व्हॉट इज कॉल्ड एज रिड्युसिंग ग्रीन हाऊस गॅस एमिशन. ही तंत्रज्ञान तुम्ही आम्हाला देणं अपेक्षित आहे, कारण ही तंत्रज्ञान तुम्ही विकसित केलेली आहेत. द डेव्हलप्ड वर्ल्ड्स पोझिशन इज ही तंत्रज्ञान विकसित करण्यामध्ये खूप घाम गाळायला लागलेला आहे. तर ते आमचं म्हणणं आहे की आम्ही त्याला नकार दिलेला नाही. द सेकंड बेसिक पोझिशन इज ही तंत्रज्ञान शासकीय मालकीची नाहीत. So none of them have been developed in what is called as a state sector as far as the developed world is concerned. Neither has the American government put anything into it, nor has the Canadian or the European governments put anything into it. These technologies have been developed on a proprietary basis by what are called as private and corporate firms in the West. So the Western position is we cannot hand over something to you which we do not own in the first place. ये जहां हमारे मालकी का नहीं है, मग आता साधा प्रश्न असा आहे ना की जर ते तुमच्या मालकीचं नाहीये, मी मागाशी तुम्हाला म्हणताना म्हटलं की व्हॉट नीड्स टू बी डन इज all manner of climate negotiations need to very seriously think of, is the nation state the right mode through which we are talking to each other, or do we need to move through some other mode. जर ती तंत्रज्ञान त्यांच्या मालकीची असतील तर मग तुम्ही नाक उचलून इथं कशाला येता? It's better that we go in for a further expansion of this negotiating business and we bring in those people who count in this entire field, rather than talking to people who after all the discussions are over would try to put up their hands by saying this that हाँ नहीं बात तो सही है पर हम कुछ कर नहीं सकते क्योंकि they belong on a proprietary basis. उनका proprietorship जो है belongs to those firms and corporations which have developed them. ते तुमच्याच देशातले आहेत ना, डू समथिंग अबाउट इट ना. पण ते तसं नाही ना करतायत. मग ते आपण डेव्हलपिंग कंट्री आहे का की असं खासगी क्षेत्रामध्ये निर्माण झालेल्या तंत्रज्ञानावरती अधिकार सांगायचा, त्याला नॅशनलाइज बिशनलाइज करायचं असलं नसतं आमच्याकडं. वी डोंट गो इन फॉर ऑल ऑफ दॅट. The world can hang, the world can sink. We are least worried about it. We would come and tell you that you have a problem on your hands, but we are not going to help you mitigate this problem. So एक तरफ you are not going to hand over those technologies. याच्यावरचा उपाय काय होता, which was suggested by countries like India? Let's raise money and buy them. तर त्या रेज मनीचा प्रॉब्लेम असा आहे की $100 बिलियन 10 वर्षामध्ये यायचे होते, 5 वर्ष झालेली नाहीयेत आणि $10 बिलियन वरती एक फुटकी कवडी आलेली नाही. So how do you go about working on that end in terms of trying to access these technologies by actually buying them upfront? तो त्याच्यामध्ये देखील there is no traction. Okay, अच्छा, why are we having all of this on our hands? Because after everything that has been said and done, as far as economic growth is concerned, purely economic growth of any country is concerned, there is a close relationship between the amount of greenhouse gases that a country emits and the levels of a country's economic growth. If you look at the Chinese, the Americans, or most of these countries that I am talking about, या सगळ्या countries' economic growth चे काही specific rates आहेत. If you look on that chart that the UNFCCC has on its website in terms of countries with the lowest emissions, Afghanistan 0.02% emissions. So of those total emissions which are done anywhere on the face of this earth, the Afghans emit only 0.02%. Obvious, what sort of economy do the Afghans have? So every single country which has a more basic, a much more smaller and a not very rapidly growing economy obviously have very low rates of greenhouse gas emissions as compared to every single country which has very high rates of growth. If you say that you bring down your emissions, you are automatically calling in for what is called as bring down growth, which they are not at all ready for. तुम्ही असं म्हटलं ना की लेट्स effectively ते येऊन थांबतं कुठं? Despite the fact that you talk about this whole thing that we have more developed technologies as compared to you, when it comes to maintaining certain rates of economic growth, it ineffectively calls in for what is known as higher energy consumption. And once you go in for higher energy consumption, you are definitely going to go in for emitting more gases. म्हणजे कितीही प्रगत तंत्रज्ञान जरी तुमच्याकडे असली ना तरी देखील तुमचे रेट्स ऑफ गॅस एमिशन्स लो होणार नाहीये. त्याचं साधं कारण असं आहे की तेवढी प्रगत तंत्रज्ञान असून देखील तुमचे ग्रीन हाऊस गॅस एमिशन्स जास्तच राहणार आहे फॉर अ सिंपल रिझन, बिकॉज पर कॅपिटा यू आर कन्झ्युमिंग मोर एनर्जी. आर यू गेटिंग दॅट? मोस्ट ऑफ दॅट एनर्जी ॲज ऑफ नाव इज बीइंग डेव्हलप्ड इन द कन्व्हेन्शनल सेक्टर. Was non-conventional energy resources, all said and done, call in for a vast amount of subsidy at the level of the government to make them accessible as far as the masses are concerned. Something which they are yet not ready for. आणि एवढं सगळं असून देखील it's automatic की what you are going to call, ज्या वेळेला you say की bring down emissions, you are also calling for moderate growth rates. Let's have more equitable growth. सही बात है ना? If you are going to talk about the world as a single economic unit, it makes a lot of sense to have decentered economic growth rather than having economic growth which is centered only in specific regions of the developed north. नाही, पण आम्हाला असल्या कुठल्याही गोष्टींबद्दल काहीही, ह्या सगळ्या गोष्टींच्या बाबतीत आपण कानावर हात ठेवणार आहे. म्हणून लिमानी सगळ्यात भारी मार्ग काय बाहेर काढलेला आहे? कॉमन बट डिफरन्शिएटेड रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटीज. सगळ्यांची कॉमन रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी आहे की 2 डिग्री सेल्सिअस झालं नाही पाहिजे, पण 2 डिग्री सेल्सिअस न होण्यामध्ये प्रत्येकाने किती एमिट केलं पाहिजे ह्याची रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी डिफरन्शिएटेड. दिस इज लाईक ईच वन ऑफ यू डिसाइड, आणि दिस इज व्हॉलंटरी. यू टेक द रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी. आय थिंक समवेअर बाय November 2015, the UNFCCC is supposed to notify on its website the figures that would come from every country which says that आमची responsibility एवढे गॅसेस कमी करण्याची आहे. मग प्रत्येक देशाला एका अर्थाने मुक्त सोडलेले आहे या सगळ्या वाळवंटामध्ये की तुम्ही ठरवा की तुम्ही किती गॅसेस कमी करणार आहात. तुम्ही तो आकडा आम्हाला कळवा, तो आकडा आम्ही नोटिफाय करू. बरं, ते सगळे एकत्रित केलेले आकडे इफ दे आर नॉट इनफ फॉर 2 डिग्री सेल्सिअस, मग काय करणार? आधी सांगा तर खरं, आपण बघू मग काय करायचं. पण डोंट आस्क हायपोथेटिकल क्वेश्चन्स ॲज ऑफ नाव, की ते जर सगळे क्युम्युलेटिव्हली आकडे 2 डिग्री सेल्सिअस पर्यंत ही तापमान वाढ जर रोखण्यात अपयशी ठरले तर मग आपण काय करायचं. ओके, सो अच्छा, आय फील दिस इज बेटर as compared to what the last decade was, for a simple reason, because with George Bush in the White House, the Americans refused to accept that there is something that is called as anthropogenic climate change. कमीत कमी या दशकाची सगळ्यात पॉझिटिव्ह गोष्ट ही असणार आहे की दे आर एटलीस्ट एक्सेप्टिंग की ह्युमन ऍक्शन इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर इन्क्रीजिंग द वर्ल्ड्स क्लायमेट and hence human action is required to bring down the world's climate. तो जो महान माणूस गेली 2000 ते 2008 तिथं बसून होता, त्यांनी तर सगळ्या कॉन्फरन्स ऑफ पार्टीजला तेल लावलेले हे सांगून हे सगळे रिपोर्ट चुकीचे आहेत, हे विज्ञानच मुळात चुकीचं आहे. And you had equally impressive American right-wing foundations as well as American right-wing studies which were completely capable of proving this point कि anthropogenic climate change is a hoax. इसका साइंस गलत है, इसके मैथमेटिकल और स्टॅटिस्टिकल मॉडेल्स गलत है. क्लायमेट चेंज मुळात तर क्लायमेट चेंज नावाची कुठलीही गोष्ट घडत नाहीये. जगाचं तापमान हे कंटिन्युअसली असं वर खाली होत राहिलेलं आहे. असं पूर्वी देखील झालेलं आहे की ज्या वेळेला जगाचं तापमान प्रचंड वाढलेलं आहे, then they used to talk about what is called as how do you think that the dinosaurs get extinct. So don't at all believe in this fraud which says that when the dinosaurs got extinct, where was man? We were nowhere around the corner. So to believe in this, it's we who are responsible for creating issues on account of which the surface climate of the earth keeps on increasing. They said ऐसा कुछ नहीं होता है, ये सब गलत है. ये कार एमिशंस, ये एयरक्राफ्ट एमिशंस, ये एमिशंस ऑन अकाउंट ऑफ बर्निंग फॉसिल फ्यूल्स कॉज एन इंक्रीज इन क्लाइमेट. I have seen studies that talked about electromagnetic heat being generated in the solar system as far as planetary bodies beyond Earth were concerned, which affected what is called as climate on Earth. त्यामुळे कमीत कमी शुक्र बना इस बात का कि you have an American government and an American administration which is accepting of the fact that there is something called as anthropogenic climate change. Human actions are responsible for it and human actions are required to bring it down. आता 2016 मध्ये जर का व्हाईट हाऊस मध्ये काही बदललं तर 2020 च्या नंतर अंमलात येणाऱ्या करारावरती अमेरिका काय भूमिका घेणार? ओ वेल, वी हॅव नो आयडिया अबाउट दॅट. We simply have no idea about anything of it. If those ekdam loony right-wing Americans who watch Fox TV end up putting their candidate in the White House, God save the world. That's the only one thing which can be said. कारण ते अजून देखील या गोष्टीच्या बाबतीत तितक्याच प्रकर्षाने क्लिअर आहेत आणि तितक्याच प्रकर्षाने ठाम आहेत की ह्युमन ऍक्शन ह्या गोष्टीला जबाबदार नाही. ह्या गोष्टी तिच्या नैसर्गिक त्यांचा एक हे असतो, त्यांनी त्या घडत राहतात. देयर इज अ लॉट विच हॅपन्स इन द सोलर सिस्टम इन विच वी आर लोकेटेड बियॉन्ड अर्थ विच इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर ऑल ऑफ दिस. त्यामुळे हे पाप आपण आपल्या डोकी मारून घ्यावं आणि त्याच्यामुळे आपण आपल्यालाच बडवत राहावं ह्याच्यात काही शहाणपणा नाही. वी शुड नॉट चेंज आवर लाईफस्टाईल्स, वी शुड कॅरी ऑन विथ देम and we should not get worried about this. The earth's climate keeps on going up, keeps on coming down, and it has happened in the past. There is nothing to be worried about all of this. त्यामुळे तुमचं घर बुडतंय, घर वाचवायचा प्रयत्न करा. त्याचा क्लायमेट चेंजशी काय संबंध आहे याचा विचार करू नका. दॅट इज रॉंग. आ रहा है समझ में? So if you look at this entire game, the way in which it has been played, it's obvious that they use this now. Say for this is good that the Obama White House at least accepts the fact that there is anthropogenic climate change. पण हे झाल्याच्या नंतर what is it that the Obama White House does? Oh well, it protects what are called as American businesses. It protects the American way of life by demanding that the world change itself so that the surface climate need not increase beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, it makes evasive commitments, एकदम evasive commitments. म्हणजे ओबामा इज गुड बिकॉज ओबामा एक्सेप्ट्स की त्या प्रत्येक गोष्टी ज्या जॉर्ज बुशनी नाकारल्या की या अस्तित्वातच आहेत तो ते स्वीकारतो. हा, वी डू टॉर्चर आर पीपल, We do torture our prisoners. Torture is bad. But are we going to stop torture? We do accept the fact we spy on our allies. We tap into every bit of information that passes online. We do accept all of this. I want to stop that. The problem is that as compared to that, at times you start feeling, जॉर्ज बुश काय वाईट होता, तो कमीत कमी या सगळ्या गोष्टी ना करायचा की याच्यातलं कुठलीच गोष्ट अस्तित्वात नाहीये. नो टॉर्चर, नो स्पाइंग, नो ग्रीन हाऊस गॅसेस, नथिंग ऑफ दिस एक्झिस्ट. सो आमच्या इनबॉक्स मध्ये असलेल्या कुठल्या फाईल्सच नव्हत्या. हे साहेब सगळं स्वीकारतात, पण सगळं स्वीकारल्याच्या नंतर सगळ्याच्या बाबतीतली ऍक्शन जी आहे ती कम्प्लिटली इवेसिव्ह आहे. इट ट्राईज टू पुश ऑन रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी टू समबडी एल्स. It tries to negotiate international treaties, charters and drafts which are extremely flexible in terms of the American commitment as far as action is concerned. So on all counts, despite the fact that he accepts everything, evasion is the first big word. Evasion is the first big action. Do not act. Because action demands that what needs to be done is the American way of life and living needs to be changed. Are you ready for that? साहेब असलं काहीतरी भलतं असेल तर बोलू नका. आफ्टर 2008 इट्स द फर्स्ट सीजन व्हेन द अमेरिकन इकॉनॉमी इज शोइंग साइन्स ऑफ ग्रोथ. सो आफ्टर 5 वेस्टेड इयर्स ऑफ ग्रोथ वी आर रिटर्निंग बॅक टू नॉर्मल ग्रोथ. आता त्याच्यामध्ये तुम्ही अँथ्रोपोजेनिक क्लायमेट चेंज आणि त्याच्यामुळे लेट्स चेंज द वे ऑफ अमेरिकन मॅन्युफॅक्चरिंग अँड ऑफ कन्झम्पशन, ह्या असल्या गोष्टी आत्ताच्या घडीला मान्य नाही. The Obama White House is a very candid explanation and a very candid acceptance of the limits of American executive power. की याच्या काय serious limitations आहेत की America's highest executive official can accept things going wrong in which the executive has a role but cannot remedy anything. Absolutely nothing. He can accept की हो हे जे चाललेलं आहे चुकीचं आहे, पण will you remedy something of this, set it right? So American executive actionच्या कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल म्हणा, पॉलिटिकल, मॉरल आणि एथिकल लिमिटेशन्स किती स्ट्रॉंग आहेत याचं जिवंत जे काही व्हेरी एक्झाम्पल अँड एपिटोम आहे ना इज व्हॉट इज कॉल्ड द ओबामा व्हाईट हाऊस. Which does understand that there is a problem on your hands, but which accepts, and they are very plain and simple about it. No, but you please, for God's sake, try to understand. As compared to us, the Chinese emissions are 8% more. The Chinese state is more of a unitary state as compared to the American state. American state system मध्ये action जर या बाबतीत ड्राईव्ह करायची झाली, it will require action at the level of the counties, it will require action at the level of the states, it will require action at different jurisdictions. जेव्हा की चायनाच्या केसमध्ये असं तुम्हाला प्रॉब्लेम नाहीये. The Chinese have a more unitary state. They can forcefully push for action if Beijing decides that it has got to act. So हमारे पीछे लगने की बजाय the best thing that the world can do is explain this to the Chinese that they need to cut on something. And the Chinese position is, yes, we should, we would, but if we don't, there is not much that you can do. Plain and simple. तुमचं म्हणणं मान्य आणि आम्ही आमच्या लेवलला प्रयत्न करतोय. आम्ही जास्त झाडं बांधतोय, आम्ही कमी प्रमाणामध्ये आमच्या नद्या खराब करतोय. We are demanding that our industries install more greener technologies. We are doing all of that. Okay, but if all this action doesn't tot up to something meaningful, in this case, the proof of the pudding is in its eating. Is the surface temperature going down? The most important thing is that. So if that is not delivered, क्या कर लोगे तुम हमारा? What can you do? Can you come in and seize Chinese economic assets? Would you stop Chinese industries from working? At the most, what can happen is the Europeans, the Americans can come together to decide on what is known as a boycott of Chinese industrial goods. So are they going to be in that sort of a position ki तेवढी decisive action तुम्ही घेणार आहे की let's identify a whole host of sectors इन चायना ज्याच्यामध्ये मॅन्युफॅक्चरिंग चालतं, विच इज रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर ड्रायव्हिंग अप द अर्थ्स टेम्परेचर. वुड यू डिमांड दॅट या सेक्टर्स मधनच, इंडिव्हिज्युअल इंडस्ट्रीज आणि फर्म्स नाही, अख्ख्या सेक्टर्स मधनं, इफ एनिथिंग सेज दॅट दिस इज मेड इन चायना, वी वुड बॉयकॉट इट. इज द वेस्ट रेडी टू टेक दॅट सॉर्ट ऑफ पोझिशन? तर आत्ताच्या घडीला प्रॉब्लेम असा आहे की जरी आमची इच्छा तसं करायची असली आणि जरी फ्रॉम अ लिबरल पर्स्पेक्टिव्ह हे शक्य असलं तरी देखील आम्ही असं करणार नाही. मग म्हटल्याच्या नंतर सगळ्यात जास्त जबाबदारी आता कोणाची येते? यू इंडियन्स. यू डू समथिंग अबाउट इट. म्हणजे आमचं म्हणणं आहे आम्ही करणार काय? वी आर एनीवे नॉट डुईंग एनिथिंग अबाउट इट. मीन पर कॅपिटा टर्म्स, a country of 1.2 billion people emitting 4 tons per year is laughable. Okay, if you look at, say for example, American emissions are 17 tons per individual per year for a country of approximately 330 million people. The Chinese emissions stand at 6.1 ton per individual per year with a population of 1.5 billion people. Funniest enough, just look at the beauty of the whole show. The United Kingdom का per capita emission 7.8 tons है. The European Union का per capita emission 7.3 tons है. Okay, with populations much smaller than, say for example, the population of India or China. And तरी देखील action is being demanded from countries like India, from countries like China. Action has been आता especially after the present Xi-Obama business, there is no more a point in tagging along with the Chinese as far as the Indians are concerned in this entire business. कारण जोपर्यंत हे त्यांच्या दोघांमध्ये बायलॅटरली ठरलं नाही तोपर्यंत when it came to the Chinese negotiating at the international level, a steady partner that they always found support with were the Indians. But now with whatever they have done unilaterally with the Americans, well, there is no point. त्या सगळ्या गेम मध्ये there is no space for the Indians. They have almost ejected out the Indians out of all of that. They don't need us. So there is no point now to tag along with them. Okay, the most demanding and vociferous in this entire business are the Europeans. But they are equally culpable with something like 7 tons. आणि ते तर चुकून देखील या गोष्टीची तुम्हाला हे देणार नाहीयेत की वी शुड गो इन फॉर इन्क्रीज रिडक्शन एज फार एज युरोपियन एमिशन्स आर कन्सर्न. सो डीप सेन्स अर्थात वाय शुड इट काउंट, वी नो दैट फॉर श्योर. मतलब आई नीड नॉट अगेन लेबर दैट पॉइंट. If the world's climate keeps on changing in the way, keeps on increasing the temperature in the way in which it is increasing as of now, it creates what are called as freak weather phenomena. It brings into a complete disruption the normal functioning of all manner of what are called as primary sector economic activities. म्हणजे त्याचा इतका मोठा परिणाम सेकंडरी किंवा टर्शरी ऍक्टिव्हिटीज वरती पडत नाही जेवढा मोठा परिणाम त्याच्या प्रायमरी सेक्टर ऍक्टिव्हिटीज वरती पडतो. फॉर कंट्रीज लाईक इंडिया with a much larger proportion of their population involved with what are called as primary sector activities, changing climates, increasing temperatures spell disaster, nothing less than that. Okay, I think I did make a mention to it in the last class. I would again make a mention to it, and I would keep on making a mention to it. The National Sample Survey Organization has this very interesting survey which they have done and which they have published for 12-13 in 2014. It's called as a Situation Assessment Survey of Agricultural Households across India. Barely 48% of Indian agriculture has a steady and a reliable source of irrigation. In states like Maharashtra, that percentage goes much lower to something like 16%, 1/6, which effectively means that most of Indian agriculture is even now dependent on something called as rains as far as the supply of water to farming is concerned. If rains keep on becoming as unreliable as they are as of now, की ज्या सीझन्स मध्ये जी पिकं तुम्हाला सगळ्यात जास्त पैसे मिळवून देतात आणि ज्यांना त्या सीझन्स मध्ये पाण्याची गरज आहे त्या सीझन्स मध्ये जर पाऊसच पडला नाही आणि ज्या सीझन्स मध्ये पावसाची गरजच नाही त्या सीझन्स मध्ये जर पाऊस पडतच राहिला Okay, so that entire cycle of what is called as agriculture gets completely disrupted. You have got to provide more, you have got to make more spacious outlays as far as public expenditure is concerned, merely to what are called as mitigate the effects of something that is known as climate change as well as temperature increase. So for a country like India, ये तो किसी भी लेवल पे समझने में मुश्किल नहीं होना चाहिए कि इसका जो इल इफेक्ट है, इसका जो एक दुष्परिणाम है, वो एग्जैक्टली किस किस्म का है. For us, it is perfect disaster that we are staring at. With a large proportion of the population involved in primary sector activities, with primary sector activities closely dependent on the working of nature, with nature getting adversely affected on account of what is called as climate change and temperature increase, you are looking at A, economic disaster, B, a consequent social disaster. आ रहा है समझ में? So for us, either ways, मतलब more rains or less rains, both of them spell disaster. Because for us, हमारा पूरा economic activity एक तरह से is dependent on what is called as a certain amount of rain during specific periods of the year. आणि याच्यातल्या दोन्ही गोष्टी सर्टन आणि स्पेसिफिक तितक्याच महत्वाच्या आहेत. We cannot have a specific amount of rain during certain periods of the year. We need a certain amount of rain during specific periods of the year. And if this doesn't work, everything goes out for a toss. So for a country like India, तो एकदम ये समझना बिल्कुल ही मुश्किल नहीं होना चाहिए कि क्लाइमेट चेंज नाम का और टेम्परेचर इंक्रीज नाम की चीजों के प्रॉब्लम्स एग्जैक्टली है तो किस किस्म के प्रॉब्लम्स है. That's the reason why we have got to be ekdam at the forefront of trying to do everything about this, both at the level of adaptation as well as the level of mitigation. But unfortunately enough, until and unless the others do not respond as far as the show is concerned, this game cannot be played. And as of now what we are having is त्यांचे एकंदरीत भूमिका खूप क्लिअर आहे. हे अशा प्रकारच्या कट्स मॅन्डेटरी ज्या आहेत, इनव्हॉलंटरी ज्या आहेत, त्या तुम्ही इम्पोज केल्याने ते देश त्या कट्स आणि त्या प्रकारच्या लिमिटेशन्स मान्य करत नाहीत. क्योटोनी हे तुम्हाला दाखवून दिलेलं आहे. म्हणून करणं काय गरजेचं आहे की लेट्स नेगोशिएट अ मोर फ्लेक्सिबल, a more accommodating sort of a treaty to which everybody would voluntarily accede. पण voluntary accession चा permanent problem तो आहे की if in that voluntary accession actual impact is not produced on the ground in terms of the actual surface temperature, how should this whole show be then dealt with? Practically speaking, no ideas about it. Are you getting it? Lima तिच्या लेवलला as I said is purely recommendatory. तो महान माणूस आता 26 तारखेला आपल्या इथे येणार आणि तो आल्याच्या नंतर what they are working at is plain and simple. एकदम you are looking out for more green technologies. Why don't you work with our companies? आम्ही तुम्हाला सबसिडाइज प्राइसेस मध्ये या टेक्नॉलॉजीज हँडओव्हर आणि ट्रान्सफर करणार नाही. आम्ही व्हॉलंटरीली विदाउट एनी कॉस्ट चार्ज या टेक्नॉलॉजीज तर बिलकुलच तुम्हाला देणार नाही. त्याच्यापेक्षा सेफ ऑप्शन काय? 2-3 प्रकारचे सेफ ऑप्शन्स आहेत. त्या त्या क्षेत्रांमध्ये जिथं तुम्हाला असं वाटतंय की तुम्हाला या वस्तूंची गरज आहे, या इंडस्ट्रियल गुड्सची गरज आहे, पण त्या प्रकारच्या इंडस्ट्रियल गुड्स तुमच्या देशामध्ये मॅन्युफॅक्चर करणं वुड रिझल्ट इन व्हॉट इज कॉल्ड ॲज ग्रीन हाऊस गॅस एमिशन्स. व्हाय डोंट यू इम्पोर्ट दोज गुड्स फ्रॉम अस? सिंपल ना, वी आर एनीवे पोल्यूटिंग द वर्ल्ड्स क्लाइमेट. व्हाई डू वी नीड टू लाइक डुप्लीकेट दिस एंटायर बिजनेस? उससे अच्छा तो ये है वी विल पोल्यूट ऑन योर बिहाफ, we will pollute on everybody's behalf. You buy the required industrial goods from us. B, if that is not possible, you buy the required technologies from us. So या तो आप manufactured goods को हमसे import करो या फिर आप technologies को ही हमसे import करो. But do not expect that we would at any level help you as far as this is concerned. आणि जॉग्राफिकली आपलं लोकेशन ज्या प्रकारचं आहे, इन द ट्रॉपिक्स, अक्रॉस व्हॉट आर कॉल्ड ॲज द मुवमेंट ऑफ मॉन्सून विंड्स, As compared to that, countries which are in a position to dictate these types of terms to countries like India are located in a completely different geography. जिथे त्यांना ह्याच्यातल्या कुठल्याही प्रकारच्या प्रॉब्लेम्सला सामोरं जावं लागत नाही. The reason why they can arrogate to themselves that sort of power and dictate terms to us is precisely because geographically we are located in a completely different section altogether of the world as compared to geographically where they are located. So they need not face this problem to the same levels to which we need to face it. They don't have the same levels of populations dependent on what are called as the vagaries of the climate as compared to, say, for example, what we have. Automatically making this a more sort of, जिसको हम कहते हैं ना, grueling sort of a prospect, a thing that is compulsory at our levels to which we need to work on as compared to them. Look at it when that man would be in India in the end of January. वो क्या टोपी पहनाने वाला है? They have been doing this for a long time, very long time. They have been trying to, त्यांचा सगळा जो आटापिटा आहे ना, तो ह्याच गोष्टीवरती आहे कि India should be detached from that club of African and Asian countries with which India roams about in all these types of negotiations. Once you have India in a bilateral commercial relationship, as far as greenhouse technologies are concerned, well, the others can be automatically taken care of. And आता तो काय, we have a government which is definitely going to respond very positively to everything. May at least can respond. You knew this for sure कि ये आदमी ऐसे ही नहीं आने वाला है. ये आदमी जरूर जो भी लेके आएगा वो चीजें आपके लिए किस किस्म के prospects open up करती है या बंद कर देती है. You knew of that, and especially on the backdrop of whatever they did with the Chinese. तो तुमच्याशी काय बोलणार आहे, तुम्हाला आमच्यापेक्षा चांगलं माहिती. पण तरी देखील तुम्ही त्यांना इन्व्हाइट केलं. You would be the first American president in any Republic Day ceremony since the Republic was constituted. Superman achievements. होतं का आतापर्यंत कोणी असं होतं का की ज्यांच्या पंतप्रधानकीच्या काळामध्ये अमेरिकन प्रेसिडेंट केम फॉर अ इंडियन रिपब्लिक डे सेरेमनी. नाउ वी हॅव इट. I enjoy. What more can be said? But they are very smart when they go about doing all these types of things. कसं नाक दाबलं की बरोबर तोंड उघडतं हे जेवढं चांगलं अमेरिकन्सला कळतं तेवढं पॉसिबली कुणालाच कळत नाही. So A, you reach out a treaty with the Chinese. B, you hold out the prospect of detaching the Indians from the club of the other developing countries. C, you sugarcoat all these types of negotiations in a manner which seems to be like it's going to be a mutually beneficial thing for both of us. And D, get them to sign on the dotted line. So they're so clever about doing these types of things, so damn clever about doing it. I don't know, how do you look at it? आ रहा है समझ में? So with this, I recommend it to y'all for your comments, for your questions and everything.